Morning, everyone. Why don't we go ahead and get started? My name is Damon Wilson. I'm Executive Vice President of the Atlantic Council. I want to thank you for joining us today. Just delighted to have you here to join us for a conversation as part of the Council's Commander Series for an address and discussion with Lieutenant General Mark Schissler, the Deputy Chairman of the NATO Military Committee. Thank you for joining us from Brussels, General. General Schissler will be discussing the situation in Ukraine and the alliance. He joins a long list of top commanders who have taken part in the Atlantic Council's Commander Series. It's a flagship series of our Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security. After the General speaks, Barry Pavel, who heads up our Scowcroft Center, will help moderate a conversation on NATO and Ukraine. I also want to offer a special word of thanks to Saab, who has helped make this session possible, this Commander Series possible. We're joined today by Michael Anderson, Joseph Evans, and John Klaus. Welcome to the Saab team. General Schissler, you join us at an important moment, an important time for the alliance and for European security. Russian intervention in Ukraine is effectively beginning to turn this country into what looks increasingly like a war zone. As the situation in Ukraine rapidly deteriorates, many are wondering what role NATO can play, what role will NATO play in the Ukraine crisis, and a conflict that that's directly on NATO's border and that directly impacts European security. There are questions looming of what kind of assistance NATO can provide to Ukraine itself. Will NATO be able to be part of a strategy to help deter aggression in Europe's east, and not just in Ukraine, perhaps? What are the implications for the alliance, and what lessons is NATO drawing for its own force posture, its own defense planning, and its own preparations for its summit this fall? Last week at the Atlantic Council, in a conference Toward a Europe Whole and Free, we had a range of conversations, including with Vice President Biden, Secretary Kerry, but also NATO's top leadership, where Deputy Secretary General Sandy Vershbow, as well as SACT and General Palomares, and SACEUR, General Breedlove, all spoke to the need of the crisis, underscoring within the alliance the need for more deployable forces, specifically calling for an upgrading of the NATO response force to respond more quickly, within days, not weeks, to potential threats. It's clear that the implications of the crisis in Ukraine have a direct bearing on alliance planning. We'll hear about that from General Schissler today. We at the Atlantic Council believe that this moment is a significant time to determine not just the future trajectory for the transatlantic relationship, but for democracy, for freedom, for rule of law in all of the Euro-Atlantic area. So as part of our response at the Atlantic Council, we're doing things like today as part of our Commander Series in the Scowcroft Center, but it's also part of a broader response on Ukraine, what we call our Ukraine in Europe initiative, where we focus on the issues at stake. At the same time, we also have been doubling down on issues facing the alliance. As part of a project the Scowcroft Center has been running on NATO in an era of global competition, we've been focused on the future of NATO's collective defense and deterrence roles, beginning post-Afghanistan, but now post-Crimea, post-Ukraine. So in the midst of the worst crisis in East-West relations since the end of the Cold War, we're fortunate to have General Schissler with us today to discuss NATO's response to the Ukraine crisis and the future roles and missions for the alliance. General Schissler has been in his position as Deputy Chairman of NATO's Military Committee since September 2013. Prior to that, he served as the Director of Strategy and Policy at the U.S. European Command in Stuttgart. And before that, he was Director of Plans, Programs, and Analysis at the headquarters of the U.S. Air Forces in Europe at Ramstein. Clearly, this is a military commander who knows Europe, knows European security well. Prior to his service in Europe, he was Director of Cyber Operations and Deputy Chief of Staff of Operations Plans and Requirements at the U.S. Air Force headquarters here in Washington. So clearly, General Schissler, you bring a breadth of experience that pertains directly to the challenges facing the alliance today. Please join me in welcoming the General to the stage.
Damon, thanks very much for a very kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for being here this morning. I would like to move around just a little bit, make it a little bit harder on the cameraman rather than be static. Damon told you about my staff experience. I will tell you that, number one, I'm not a commander now. I have been a commander before. It's the best job in the world. I'm merely a staff guy now, and that's what we graduate into. I would love the opportunity to command again, and if any of you have any way you can help me on that, I'd be glad to do that. Barry and I started a conversation literally a half a year ago or more about the chance to come over here and talk to you and give you a little update on NATO. Clearly, if you listen to Damon and if you've read the paper this morning, I'm now caught in a flurry of people that are talking about what's going on in NATO. But when Barry and I talked about this as a concept, nobody had really been over here lately to update the Atlantic Council on NATO. It sounded like a great idea. The world's in quite a different place today than it was when we started the conversation. And my hope is that in the next hour or so I can be of service to you to help understand at least how NATO looks at what's going on in the world today. I certainly don't have all the answers. I'm not privy to all the plans in the future, but I can tell you about how it's working through the process in Brussels that I get to watch every day. Last thing I want to say before I change slides is today is the 6th of May. And it's special to me. In fact, I engineered part of this trip to be in Washington this week. I was commissioned 33 years ago this day. And for me, I couldn't think of a better way to spend this day than to try and explain some of what I'm doing now in a place where there were a lot of people that wanted to listen. So I was trying to be in Washington this week. I'm doing some other things at the Pentagon. It's been an incredible experience for me as a person to serve as a military officer, but more incredible, and somebody commented on it just before we started, about being promoted and being a lieutenant general in the United States Air Force in 2014 is a particularly phenomenal experience that I never saw in my future. And so people thank me all the time for my service. I want to thank you for the opportunity to serve America for as long as I have. As I thought, as a navigator in C-130s, I thought I would have gone home 10 or 12 years ago. And so it's a particular pleasure for me to still be wearing the uniform. And I couldn't be happier than to be with you here this morning on a day as special as this for me. Next, please. Oh, yeah, I'm supposed to do that. That's my job today. So, can anybody tell me who that is? Anybody? I bet somebody knows. The year is 1991. The location is Rhein-Main Air Base, Germany. It's December. That's a returning hostage. He was the longest held. There we go. Now we're there. Terry Anderson. So why start with Terry Anderson? Because I really want to put your mind in a place to think about how much, but just think back to 1991. Where was the world at then, and where do we find ourselves now? It's an amazing experience for me. I was a captain back then. I was on the flight line. In fact, there's an article written. I was a wing exec, and I had done about 4 of these arrivals, the protocol for them, during that week because the hostages came home at the end in almost a group. Almost every night we received somebody. 6:39 in the morning he landed. It was phenomenal. He was the longest held. You look at him, he looks great. He did not look like most of the other hostages who were really quite haggard and worn looking. Terry looked really healthy. Rather inspirational to see a man like that held as long as he was, to hold out hope and be ready to go. December 1991, we'll come back to that in a minute. You might also, while I'm talking, you might think back in your head about what else went on in 1991 because it was a pretty amazing year, and we'll come back to that. So this you will recognize as Tahrir Square 2 or 3 years ago, and that was in one way the beginning of something that's still going on today. We looked for how to call it and eventually settled on Arab Spring. That wasn't exactly the only place it started, but that was one of the beginning acts of Arab Spring. We didn't understand it then. We're still trying to interpret it now. It gave rise to a movement where people went to the town square and gathered in large numbers to make commentary about their elected or official government and asked for change in many cases. And that one was concerning for all the right reasons, and it gave birth to other events. This is the Maidan when it was fairly peaceful, when it was a large group of people, but clearly in the November, December timeframe before it went up. And that's the Maidan as you remember it in February or so, as things got very dicey. It was very unclear what the future was, and the protest became violent and difficult and unsafe at best. Back to 2009. You would all remember this. You'd recognize the players, Secretary of State Clinton and and Sergei Lavrov. And what word was on that button? What word was intended to be on that button, I guess, which reminds you that what you remember about that event, unfortunately, is all the press that was written about whether the word, the desired word, was reset, talking about our relationship with Russia, that reset was the word that was on that button. Unfortunately, once translated into Russian, it was open to conversation about whether the State Department aides who made that button captured exactly the right word, or did they capture a different word that actually sent quite a different message to Mr. Lavrov that day. So it's important because we, the United States government, and I should probably say at this point, I'll use we, and I'll try to be clear whether I'm talking about the United States or NATO, as I wear a uniform that says United States on it, but I fulfill a job where I'm trying to talk to you as a NATO representative. So we, in the case of the United States, we're trying to send a message to the government of Russia that we want to start over in our relationship, that this was well after the Cold War had ended, and we wanted to restart, we wanted to begin over, and that's what that reset was all about. Now, let me offer this perspective to you. Maybe as Americans, when we went to that act and that meeting and said, let's reset, maybe we were thinking of maybe a shorter time frame than the Russians were. And that's why I went to this. I listened to a Finnish intelligence officer give a briefing about history about a month ago. And he really captured my mind with the thought that Russia and Russians take a very long view on history. It may be that as Americans, we sometimes take too short a view, and that may have been the case that day with Mr. Lavrov. That is the Byzantine Empire symbol, two-headed eagle, been used in other places since then and currently in use on the Russian official flag. Interesting, I think, that the same symbol is there. That flag is of the Russian Federation, not the Empire of Russia, but it would make you wonder how long a time frame is Mr. Putin thinking about right now? How long a time frame are they looking back on as compared to the one that we might have been thinking about? So this was his entry to, I think, what was seen as a key speech that he gave in March. That's pretty triumphal looking when I look at the image, and if you look in back behind his head, there's the eagle again. He was making a statement. He seems, Mr. Putin always makes a statement in the way he appears. That was a phenomenal piece of entry, and the venue in which he gave the speech was all very well scripted. It was all very effective for communicating his message. So he's delivering something that's bigger maybe than we were thinking about. Let me switch gears for just a minute. I'm going to hit you on about 3 or 4 different levels. Let me give you an update so you know what NATO's doing operationally right now and has been for the whole time that I've been at NATO headquarters. Number one, let me start at the top because it's getting a lot of attention now. It used to not get much. Air surveillance and air policing, obviously going on, been expanded in the last 3 weeks. Now happening out of a couple locations. Not currently, air surveillance not currently going on at Iceland, but NATO is responsive to Icelandic requests for air surveillance over their area as well. As Russia increases long-range aviation flights, that's when the Icelanders become uncomfortable, and we routinely will provide short periods of air surveillance in Iceland as well. You're probably well familiar with how we've expanded air policing. I'll be happy to answer questions if that's useful to you later. In KFOR, we've still got a sizable contingent under the command of General Sal Farina, an Italian, doing quite well, and as you know, things are quite calm there. Even in Mitrovica, where we used to talk about the north being just a little bit restive, it even appears pretty calmed down. So KFOR is more stable than it has been in a long time. Active endeavors, quite active in the Mediterranean, doing a mission to look at what is flowing through the Mediterranean. So not just extremists, but the flow of money, the flow of people, trafficking, and everything that would be affecting Europe's southern flank. And that bears some attention. I would just offer to you, don't lose sight of the Mediterranean, what's going on there. That can have a tremendous effect as we pay a lot of attention to other parts of the map in Europe. The Patriots are on station in Turkey, as they have been for close to a year and a half now. That mission extends through December 31st of this year. It would have to be renewed by nations at Turkey's request. Operation Ocean Shield, out off the Horn of Africa, has been very successful. Actually, a relatively small number of ships. There's more partnerships right now than there are NATO ships there. And that's actually a good thing that our partners are willing. Some of our partners from the Far East are over there right now, which is a long sail for them. It's been largely effective, and there hasn't been a piracy event, I think, since 2012. There's still 50 hostages being held. But on reflection, when you look at the mission that we have there, it's been one of the more successful things that we've done way out of area, way out of our normal interests, and done it with a lot of partners. The EU is doing a similar mission, Atlanta, in the same area. The question is out there circulating quite regularly about, is there a way to combine those two missions into one for better efficiency? So that will probably develop over coming months. And let me talk to you a little bit about Afghanistan. I think I have a couple of slides coming up. So in April, the election was held, and by all accounts, by every measure, a completely successful event that was secured by the Afghan security forces. No small accomplishment, given if you would rewind your mind a couple years back and say, how many people were saying that I bet by 2014 the Afghans could secure their own country, cover large events, have a free election, have 90% of their polling places open, collect the ballots, and move on, just like a very established democratic nation does. Be honest, all of us would have said it's never going to happen. They can't do that. They're not anywhere near that. And they weren't 2 years ago. They developed with amazing speed, and they've been very effective. Now, they've suffered casualties at about the same rate that ISAF suffered them a year earlier. And that's been a heavy toll for the Afghans over the period since June when they took over. But we are completely in support of them. They are leading the operations, making the choices on what they do, and they've been very successful. So elections were important. You know the outcome, and we're up against a runoff that will probably happen in June. The results probably won't be out until August. Both candidates in the runoff say they would sign a BSA. I think one of them said he would sign it as his first act, which I'm not sure what first act means when you get elected and you become the president in Afghanistan, how soon the first act follows. There's a lot of things to do as you take office. So at any rate, the elections were a pivotal moment in Afghanistan. The other thing that people pay a lot of attention to right now is, okay, what are we going to do next? What's the future of the ISAF mission? It ends on the 31st of December. That's a fact. The question is, are we going to transition to a different mission? And I chose that picture just to talk to you about the challenge of doing logistics and to tell you that as I sit with the logisticians at NATO from the 28 countries, they have it all figured out. And you should relax with high confidence in some very professional logisticians using a system that is actually fairly expensive because they're moving almost everything by air. But the lines of communication that aren't completely available to us, they have worked options to go other ways. They're all very confident that they can complete and they could move their people and their equipment by the end of the year and be out of Afghanistan if that's what we're asked to do. On the other hand, it's much harder to figure out without a BSA and a SOFA if we'll be invited to participate in Afghanistan in a train, advise, and assist mission beginning on the 1st of January. If we are, then we need to position the correct forces in the correct places with the right kinds of equipment to begin that mission on the 1st of January. That is an extremely tall order. And the longer we delay getting that guidance, the harder that task becomes. So again, back to the logisticians, we may ask them for more miracles before the end of the year, because if we are invited and we get a mission and it's planned and approved, then we'll have to go and set up the right places for the right kinds of mission at the locations that SHAPE gets approved by the NAC. It would be really elegant if all that was already done and we were just in the business of moving out of ISAF and moving into RSM locations. We're not there. Given what I just told you about elections, If the new president said he did it at the minute he got elected, that still might be in August. He may not take office until September. So you can see where it presses right up against what General Dunford would describe as the only usable time that would be left is about 100 days at the end of the year. That's enough to get out. It's going to make it really hard to both move that equipment and people out and bring in the right people for the follow-on mission. And they will be, in most cases, different people and a lot of different equipment. So it'll be a totally different kind of mission. Happy to talk to you some more about that. My bottom line on this is, on the logistics side, you should have tremendous admiration for the men and women that do logistics in NATO and the magic that they've been able to work out. They have figured out how to do this, and the nations are paying the bill to get their things home. So it's actually, it will be a good news story. It's just still not going to be easy. Again, aviation and air policing. I was in both Latvia and Estonia over the last couple of weeks. I have seen the response. I have seen the same things that their Minister of Defense talked about in Latvia just a couple of days ago. He said, our people are afraid. They are, because they have a big history, and I didn't really appreciate the Latvian history until I spent a couple of days there and looked at exactly what's happened to them over the last 50 or 60 years. And I very much appreciate why they are concerned about what's developed. Estonia sits right on the border, and the presence of even a small number of ground troops and the presence of our air policing makes a big difference in that region. So they're, while you couldn't be completely satisfied, they are greatly assured by those actions. And again, speaking as a NATO guy, thanks to the United States for moving quickly on both moving airplanes and moving parts of the 173rd into positions in the Baltics. So here's a series of 3 slides that I'll flip through quickly. South China Sea, that's the Chinese coast on the left, and that's one way to describe an air defense identification zone. These are current. This is going on right now. If you're a person who only thinks to the right on the Atlantic side of the world, on the Pacific side, there's all kinds of news just this week as well after the president was there. Here's another view that the Japanese view that air defense identification zone, that area, quite differently than the Chinese do. That's the source of some disagreement. There's 3 ways to look at, that's the Korean view of their air defense identification zone. And so I bring those in to this brief, and I have reminded other people that we can't think about just one part of the world. This whole thing is connected. It's connected by time and space, and the global situation has all the makings of being incredibly complicated very quickly. So China's making a statement here about really just some airspace and some rocks. The islands beneath that airspace are not populated, but the next island north of there is Okinawa. And so if China makes a really sincere play for those islands that are called by 2 names, and I'm not going to go down the path of getting caught calling them one or the other and say that I favor that name, but the Chinese and the Japanese call them by different names. If they're successful in making a play for those islands, it'll put the United States in a very tough position between standing with its long-term ally Japan and facing down China over some rocks in the water. If you don't face them down and they decide that emboldens them, their next move might be to go north, and the next place is Okinawa. So that's a real challenge, and that's happening in real time. I suggest to you that the Chinese also read the paper. They know what's going on in other parts of the world. They understand timing, so they know that their pressure comes at a bad time for the rest of the world as we try to apply equal attention in various places. I mentioned that President Obama was in Asia, I think, just last week. It's hard to balance. It's hard to tell a story. It's hard to make the word we're balancing to the Pacific at the same time that you're facing the challenges we are in Europe. It's hard to say that you're not paying equal attention to both places, or that you might need to pay more attention to one or the other. It's very hard to come off successfully as the world is pretty challenging in a variety of places right now. I put Mr. Snowden in for one reason and one reason only, and that's to say that individuals have actually found ways to become just as important as nations and states in this world. So WikiLeaks and Mr. Snowden have challenged big nation states, big systems, and they continue to affect how we make policy, how we make decisions. I would offer to you the way to think about Mr. Snowden is he is a super empowered individual. And even in his, whatever he's in, his Russian exile or whatever status he's in, he managed to become the center of the news again last week with Mr. Putin in kind of an interview sort of an event. But it put him front and center again, which is, I find very fascinating. He's just one guy in a world with 7 or 8 billion people. Or where's that guy? How's he get on the front page again? But he did. And so we have to pay attention to people like that. We have to watch out for people that become super empowered because they can become more powerful than most nations, maybe for a short time, maybe for a long time. But we have to deal with that in the same way that we had to learn how to deal with non-state actors as they became very powerful in the recent past. If you've ever listened to Admiral Stavridis' brief, he was my boss while I was at European Command. Admiral Stavridis always had a bridge in every briefing. Now, his particular style of bridge was the big, majestic span bridge that was phenomenally impressive from every angle. I don't always use a bridge, but I'm using one here for a particular reason this morning. For me, I'll tell you about the bridge in a minute, but the bridge is all about the transatlantic link. It's all about the bond. It's all about the importance of that, and that's the only thing I want to drive home on this slide. That's the bridge between the mainland of Massachusetts and Gloucester, Massachusetts. And I'll go on leave there next week, and I'll cross the Pyatt Bridge to get there. And every time you want to do business away from Gloucester or Rockport, you have to cross that bridge. And you might notice that that bridge is under renovation. It's a simple little bridge. You can see that's a little power boat crossing there. It's not a big, that's the Annisquam River. It's not a big piece of water. It's nothing like the Atlantic Ocean. It's not even a suitable metaphor for what I'm talking about. But listen, that bridge is under renovation. That's a recent picture, about a year old. And I'd suggest to you that that's what the transatlantic link is right now. We're under renovation. We're all about reappreciating how important the bond between North America and Europe is. Half the world's GDP goes there. I don't have to sell you on any of that because you're all part of the choir. I get that. But we need to remind other people, and we need to give them examples and ways to think about it so that they understand. I spent a lot of time while I've been in Europe helping military leaders believe that the U.S. is not turning their back on Europe while we rebalanced to the Pacific, while we paid appropriate attention to what was going on in another region of the world. And after a couple years, they began to believe that, and they saw that we were stayers. But that link is critical. And I really believe we are in a period of renovation. We're repainting, we're resurfacing, and we need to figure out how to talk about our bond with Europe effectively, not just to ourselves, to a much broader audience so they understand how important it is as well. I suspect you're probably much better at that than I am. I really welcome hearing from you about how we can do that, but I think that's a point we have to make to people. I also wanted to make the point that NATO was formed in 1949. It is not an organization ready to go into retirement yet. And so we are alive and well, even if we are at a ripe age of 65. We are not laying down. We're not ready to quit. And we're doing lots of things. Interestingly, those things on the bottom of the slide, I'll talk to you briefly at the last slide about the Wales Summit. Those are things that we knew we were going to talk about at the summit, and we still will. But the summit in Wales with heads of state will be far pithier than talking about conceptual things like smart defense. There will be real red meat on the table that we'll have to chew through, as well as talking about conceptual things that are very important about how we exercise and how we keep ourselves capable and ready in the NATO alliance. I don't need to spend much time here, and I think listening to who you've listened to lately from NATO and Europe, you understand about defense budgets, and I've seen it hammered home. I know Secretary Hagel was hammering on this just in the last couple of days as well. Calling nations to reach 2%. Very difficult to do. Only 3 nations are currently doing it, and we need, in order for NATO to be strong, we have to have good investment. It's very difficult in the economic times. We all get all that. We have to hold the goal out there. It's a NATO agreed goal at 28 nations to go there, and they acknowledge that, and most nations are working towards it, but we need to remind folks about how important spending is. And this would be my last slide. In September, we'll go to Wales. for a summit. It'll be Secretary General's last official event in NATO. As I showed you, there were some conceptual things we planned to talk about, plus probably cyber policy. Now we will need to deal extensively with Ukraine, whatever crisis is developing since then, and what our future strategies are, and what kind of focus NATO will have as we bring the heads of state together. It's both an exciting time and a real challenge to think about the summit. It's packed our schedule since the beginning of the year to hold enough ministerials to get topics ready for the summit, and yet all that's been very much upended in the last couple of months. And so while we'll work those topics, we'll also work the current situation and then seek decisions or positions as appropriate for the summit, which will happen in September of this year. That's it. Mr. Pavel?
Great, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Why don't we come up on stage here? Thanks, Jen. Well, that was just a fascinating and far broader discussion than I've seen in quite a while about NATO and all it's doing, including on the Ukraine crisis itself. And so I just wanted to ask a few questions first, and then we'll throw it to the audience, because we do have a rather expert audience on these questions. Sort of the breadth of your presentation raises a question that just came to me as I was digesting it all, and that is, here in particular at the Atlantic Council, we're seized with the Ukraine crisis, to use a diplomatic term. But it seems to be sort of a predominant focus for our European security work, which people wouldn't be surprised about. But it struck me that your presentation, which undoubtedly reflects the NATO Military Committee, isn't only focused on Ukraine. There's a lot going on already, and there's a lot that might go on. And so I'm just curious, sort of, what's the feeling in the Military Committee? Are we in a new era? How much time does Ukraine take up relative to other issues? How much of a priority is it compared to all of the other things that you discussed for NATO military planners?
Thanks. Really good question. The first thing I want to say, reference that is, we've had a lot of conversations lately about whether NATO can do A or B. And one of the things that I showed you was NATO can do a whole lot of things at one time. It's always been our intention. You can see operationally we plan to do 4 or 5 things at one time. We had not planned to have a crisis in Ukraine in conjunction with those other 4 or 5 things we were doing. But with complete confidence, I can tell you we can do that as well. We thought the rest of this year was about getting out of Afghanistan and doing the planning to transition to a new mission. But the reality is the Ukraine does take a lot of time. Ukraine considerations in the NAC take up, I would say, about half of their discussion time of late in the last month or so. The ambassadors want to understand what's going on. They want to understand operationally what's being planned, and then they're trying to figure out which nations can agree with which kinds of actions and where they can gain consensus at 28 so we can move forward. And so that takes a fair amount of consultation. In the background, all those other things run rather harmoniously and without a whole lot of effort, as they have. So that's kind of a good news story. But we've said it to ourselves a couple of times when people have asked questions. Yes, NATO can do more than one thing at a time. And we should be assured by that in our own level of reassurance.
I see. Let me sort of raise a political question, which has to do, I think, with NATO heads of state and their military priorities. I mean, my personal view for the last several years with Afghanistan winding down was that NATO was involved in a lot of operations, some more discretionary than others. And we can go through that list that you showed, and certainly some allies consider some to be a very high priority, and I would think the alliance does as well. But some are arguably of lesser priority, and it strikes me that if we really want NATO to be strategic in an era where not only are we faced with the sort of what's to come regarding Russia and the Ukraine crisis, but also other surprises that may come up and involve NATO. And I think you hit a lot of them that people think might be implausible NATO issues today, but could be in the future. So has there yet been a sense in the alliance that we should look at all the things we're doing and start to prioritize the level of effort that we're devoting to some of the lesser priority operations that perhaps other entities could handle, so that we can really focus our increasingly scarce military assets on our top priorities?
Really well-stated question that proves you already understand the answer, which I like a lot, and that is there are things that the EU and NATO could do together or that we could combine if we can get to a place we can agree with that. That's number one. Number two, do some missions have more priority than others? Absolutely. And the ones that look like a crisis and are close to home become the closest gator to the boat, and that's the one you're going to go after. That's where we are right now with Ukraine. And then I guess there's not really any discomfort with where we are. I read an online article this morning that talked about how NATO got it wrong. Some of you may have seen it. If you haven't, you'll see it later today. I'm not convinced we got it wrong in the sense that we were doing out-of-area operations. Let me make a plug for the people that are not members of NATO that we call partners, and Ukraine is one of those. Those out-of-area operations, including Afghanistan, Iraq, the Ocean Shield, those have brought us in contact with militaries and nations that are way away from Europe, been very useful to us. They've provided significant parts of the operational capability, and we have an enduring relationship with lots of nations that probably will never be members of NATO because it's not necessarily even in their or our interest for them to join. Yet being able to operate with them strengthens our alliance and our military abilities around the world. So that's kind of a good news story, and I encourage you to go look for that story because it begins with a point that because we spent a lot of time in the last 10 or 15 years in out-of-area operations, that NATO missed the boat, and now we're not really prepared for the crisis that lays before us. Not sure I agree with that, although it's an interesting article, well worth the read.
Okay. Thanks very much. Let me turn to Ukraine, and I was really pleasantly surprised and impressed to see the slides you had on Tahrir Square. So you sort of talked about people power, which is an issue we in the Scowcroft Center are spending a lot of time on now, and we sort of consider this a Westphalian plus world where nation states aren't going away, but they're joined on the international stage by very powerful movements, groups, non-state actors that can take very significant action on a global or regional scale. In fact, there's a conference next week, May 14th, with General Dempsey and others that will address the defense implications of this new world that we're entering. So I was really impressed to see that there. And it leads me to a question about what's going on in Ukraine itself. I mean, I see all over CNN and other networks sort of pro-Russian separatists, pro-Russian rebels, and those kinds of phrases. Yet I see in other frames that these are Russian special forces, Russian intelligence operatives, Russian sort of other Russian personnel directly instigating what's going on in eastern Ukraine, and who knows in the future instigating other instability in other places in Europe that might be vulnerable to such measures. We discussed this a little bit at the Atlantic Council conference last week, but what's your take on the people that are doing this? Are those indigenous people? Is it Russians who have infiltrated from Russia, achieving President Putin's objectives? What's the military committee's take on what's actually going on the ground, and sort of your education of us on this issue would be most helpful?
I don't know that I have a more informed perspective on that than anybody else, but there's certainly a lot of clues that some of the people that showed up there were incredibly well equipped, and they were armed and uniformed in a way that only an organization can do. So were they Russian? We found evidence of Russian vehicles. Did they just happen to be in Ukraine that day? Maybe. Seems like there's a lot of clues that they were at least backed by the Russian government, and they had Russian equipment and Russian vehicles. There was a lot of denials of that. That's sort of the facts as they stand. As the events have gone on, there have been denials that they were Russian, suggesting that they just got all that stuff at a hunting store. Doesn't sound plausible to me. And they're a little too capable, a little too organized to be acting as just sort of the mob factor. So I saw the Secretary General made some very thoughtful comments, I think, on this exact question yesterday. And his main theme was, if they were Russian or they are Russian, it's in Russia's interest to withdraw them and de-escalate rather than to continue to fan the flames. So he called on them, as he has on the Russian government repeatedly, to look at ways to de-escalate and turn down the volume rather than turn it up. Unfortunately, yesterday, we know things got really exciting in Odessa, a totally different area than we'd seen fighting before. So it doesn't appear that that's happening at all, but that's still the call from NATO.
I see. So let's sort of talk a little bit about NATO's approach to this. I mean, to me, there's a short-term set of measures that are required. But indeed, if this is a more significant undertaking, if it is indeed Russia embarking on sort of a new period of instigation and fomenting instability in Europe, especially to the extent that Russia thinks that it can get away with this, as it already has. What's NATO's strategy for dealing with this? What's its military strategy? We've already seen some near-term measures, and the Deputy Secretary General of NATO, Ambassador Vershbow, at the Atlantic Council last week said there's likely more to come, even in 2014, that there's other measures in the works without specifying yet what those are. But sort of my broader question is, how is NATO thinking about this? It's early yet. Is there a strategy developed for even the medium term for the different types of measures that the alliance might be taking to deal with this threat, and in particular to help Eastern European NATO members be reassured that the reason they joined the alliance to deal with this very type of threat is indeed justified and that they will be protected?
Thanks. Indeed, the NAC is tasked, shaped to do planning, both short and long-term planning, and that's underway. General Breedlove will forward it back to them. It's not due yet, so it's not there yet, and I won't see it until just before they do. I like the fact that you brought in strategy. One of our concerns in the military committee, my boss, General Bartels, has said rather pointedly, and will continue to say, that one of our worries is that people become too operationally focused. That, for instance, today, you become all fixated about Odessa. We need to be thinking way beyond what's happening today and tomorrow and thinking about what are Russia's ends, what are they going towards, and how, if it's our desire to blunt those or to make sure that they're not achieving their ends, what are our ends? How would we like to see Europe free and whole? Those are pretty good words, and at peace. That's the way the Secretary General always talks about it, free, whole, and at peace. How do we get to that end? Because we're not there right now. And so if you focus on how many, and I heard this at least 100 times in the last 5 days, little green men are in your downtown, and what are they doing there? You're not paying attention to what's in the longer term. So I think you'll see the military committee try and push the NATO leadership to think long term. And clearly, as we look at a summit, or as you talk with the defense ministers, they're thinking a little bit longer term. We have to get the entire council thinking long term and thinking about all the possible developments that could show up as a result of this. You asked, what else is going to happen? We don't know what else is going to happen, but we need to think about what could happen and have plans for A, B, and C if we can postulate them effectively.
Yeah, let me sort of follow up on that. And you said plans for A, B, and C. And sometimes I think about this as, what do we do regarding Ukraine itself, which is not a NATO member, but which shares our values to some degree, and which has a relationship with NATO, and indeed was subject to the Budapest Memorandum, which did have some security aspects to it, as we all know. So there's the Ukraine part, which is somewhat less, legally central to NATO, but still potentially very important. But then there's also the NATO membership part and collective defense. And one of my precepts for defense planning is you want to get ahead of threats before they're at your doorstep. Mm-hmm. So the way I think about this for NATO members itself is we're sort of a couple of major incidents away from large-scale instability across Ukraine, potentially a protracted civil war, potentially an insurgency, potentially Russian forces back on the borders of Poland, of the Baltics, and of other NATO members who abut Ukraine. And so, is there any sense in the alliance that we need to get ahead of tomorrow's headlines or July's headlines? And what can we do to prevent or deter that very eventuality, so that if that comes, we have a much bigger defense problem than we do today? So are there ways that the military committee and the NAC is thinking about getting ahead of July's headlines instead of dealing with May's headlines?
I think the first installment on getting ahead of that is things like moving some of the 173rd and bulking up air policing, which were able to be done quickly. How we deal with the NATO response force, what kind of land forces can we generate in NATO, and how quickly can we have them in a correct position? One of General Breedlove's big concerns. It turns out that we've spent a lot of time operating together on a variety of places and doing a variety of missions in the last 10 years. We haven't been challenged with a collective defense kind of a mission until now. And so we will retool and make sure that we both have the right kinds of forces, and nations are willing to come forward with the right kinds of forces. And I think, as you heard from the Baltic nations, they're very interested in seeing land forces. They appreciated air policing, but they also wanted to see land forces. So the symbolic, 150-man company is not sufficient to repel another nation state, but it sends a powerful signal about your commitment to go there and to stand. And so we have to figure out what those strategies are. Absolutely. That is indeed a little bit longer term work. So I would tell you the SHAPE staff is challenged operationally by dealing with today. At the same time, long-term planners think about how to retool and rebuild the strategy for NATO and a collective security responsibility as well.
I see. And so just to sort of put a fine point on it, so you don't have any doubt that if it came to that United States forces and other members of NATO would come to the defense of the Baltics or other countries that might be threatened in the future by Russian forces and other tools of Russian aggression?
That's an easy question. NATO exists to provide security to its members, and the Article 5 challenge that you alluded to is one that would elicit an immediate and a complete response to. And there's no question the members will come to the aid of others if they're challenged. Ukraine is a different situation because it's a partner. We don't have an agreement to provide forces on the ground. It's not our intent to do that, and we see the solution to that being political, not military. So it's the complete difference of, are you a member or are you a partner?
I see. One more question, and then I'll throw it out to the audience. And the question's a hard one. I mean, the types of tools, so this is one I don't have an answer to. The types of tools that I've seen used, that we've seen used in this unfolding crisis, intelligence operatives, energy supplies, cyber, sort of nuanced forms of warfare, and there's other more technical terms. These are not sort of NATO's traditional toolkit. The response from the West has been part military, part economic sanctions, which we know are having some effect. But the question I have is, in light of these tools being used rather effectively, and I go all the way back to the 1990s where the term asymmetric came up in defense planning, which are not playing to the strengths of the other side, it strikes me that these aren't part of NATO's toolkit. Some of them are in the EU toolkit. Some of them are in NATO toolkit. I forgot to mention propaganda and what we sometimes call information operations. Do we yet have the mechanisms for responding to this challenge in a coherent and strategic way? Is it only a NATO-EU coordination effort? Do we need some other sort of mechanisms? Are people in the alliance, are officials sort of thinking about the breadth of this challenge and what might be required to counter it effectively?
So I'll take a little stab. I don't have answers to all that. Absolutely, on the allusion to strategic communications, we have been working to make that a more effective effort. It's difficult to do. We're being played quite hard on the information front right now. Cyber is one where NATO is developing quickly and recognizes the need to do that. It has some members that are particularly effective there. And as everything else NATO does, we rely on the members, and they bring different capabilities forward. And so I think within the alliance, there's plenty of capability. It's not universal across the membership. And so I think the answer to your question broadly is NATO would agree with your assessment of the challenge of the current world, and it's not playing by the classic rules. In fact, just yesterday, I think what happened in Ukraine was described by a couple of folks, including General Breedlove, as slow motion warfare. It is not classic warfare. It doesn't follow the precepts that we usually think about as how you go to war. But clearly, there's something happening that looks military, and it's a different form of warfare. So we'll adapt.
I think the slow motion part makes it a little easier to get it. We know what's coming next, but obviously I don't think we're quite there yet in terms of finding the tools to deter the next steps in escalation. So I think with that, I'd love to go to the audience. Please wait for the microphone if I call you and identify yourself. And I think we have a gentleman in the back row there.
Good morning, General. Thank you for your presentation. Jeff Goldstein from the Open Society Foundations. You mentioned that NATO has worked very closely with the Ukrainian military as part of the partnership program. It seems as though what the Ukrainians call their anti-terrorist operation has not gone particularly well so far. So I'd appreciate your estimation of the capability of the Ukrainian military to deal not with a conventional threat, but with the kind of internal security threat that we're seeing today.
You want to answer each question, or are you taking a series?
Sure.
Each one?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think the interesting thing, and it's a little bit nuanced the way you asked me the question. What do I think the Ukrainian military capability is prefaced by what's happened to them in the last month. They've lost much of their southern capability, most of the Crimean forces. They're now unorganized, at least in those forces, trying to rejoin other units. Secondly, much of the response is predicated by the political decision about how to respond. And that has been particularly difficult as they're in a transition government right now. So I think before we grade the military, we probably have to grade the whole country. And the crisis comes at a particularly inopportune time for the whole of government there. And so I would tell you that the Ukrainians were willing partners, and they were active in a lot of things we did, and came alongside NATO and looked forward to participating more with NATO. Their military would get better over time. All of their capability is from the Russian time. All of their equipment is Russian, and basically the Russians just took over all of their fleet in the Black Sea fleet. So they have one ship left in the Black Sea, and so most of their army units are spread out around the country. Obviously, the ones in the east are being well challenged right now. And they also may be faced with a mission that they're not completely, perfectly well trained for, as it came without much warning to them. So that's kind of an around the way to think about that. But I think the political side of that complicates the military's ability to respond significantly, both in timing and in direction.
If I could follow up, I mean, I was reminded that during the Georgia when Russia invaded Georgia, there were things that either NATO members did or the alliance did that were sort of helped to, I think, deter the takeover of the entire country, including the capital, Tbilisi, where, for instance, we ended up flying in humanitarian supplies and in various ways had sort of non-lethal but still U.S. boots on the ground in the capital. I mean, are there measures like that, sort of, are they even in the discussion in the military committee, to your knowledge? I mean, are there things that we can do that are not provocative, but nevertheless send a signal that we care about a sovereign country's territorial integrity in 2014 in the heart of Europe?
Sure. Actually, the part that I know about that isn't in the NATO committee. It's actually in European Command. So U.S. European Command has taken action in a variety of those areas and provided supply as a binational arrangement between the U.S. and Ukraine. So not from NATO and not planned by NATO.
Okay, thanks very much. I had another question in the back, Dr. Benendijk.
Thanks, Hans Benendijk. First, Barry, let me just say, with regard to your last question, I do think NATO needs to be thinking much more deeply about exactly that. You know, how do you prevent the entire takeover of Ukraine? What can we do along those lines? But let me, General, ask you a question about the Baltic states. If we're in a new world and we need to think the unthinkable, I think we would all agree that NATO is prepared to defend the Baltic states. But my question is, how do you do that? Is NATO prepared today to do that? We have seen Russia's ability to mass forces very quickly in the exercises they've done in that area. I'm not sure NATO is prepared today to defend the Baltic states. We have put forward tripwires, we've indicated intent, but from a military perspective, could I ask you, what do you think it would take to defend the Baltic states?
Sir, I guess it depends on what, if it was Russia, what the opponent brings to you. I'll be very plain with you. The challenge that NATO has right now is the positioning of forces. Do we have forces that are trained for that kind of a force-on-force engagement? Can we mass them and have them positioned in the right places? And that's, when you ask about the Baltic states, it's particularly difficult because the Baltic states have relatively small standing armies, and they face a long border with Russia. And so the advance in Mr. Putin's operations thus far, he has the advantage of operating from interior, from his own country, with good lines of communication and reinforcement. So NATO is challenged by not being in that position right now. And so that's what General Breedlove is working on, and he's trying to determine what is the correct and necessary level of response, and how do we position forces for that. And that's current work that he's doing.
I don't want to let you off the hook there. From your own, I understand that General Breedlove is analyzing that, but from your own personal military perspective, what do you think it would take?
I guess the answer to that is it would be a complete air, ground, and sea kind of a capability, but how do you know where to put it until you understand the intent of the opponent? Because we don't know the intent, and so I don't know that that's the right place to lock down all of NATO's force capability, and so that's part of the challenge. I think it would take an extensive amount of NATO's defensive capability to defend the Baltics. I think that's a given. If the intent of Russia was to invade, say, Estonia.
Another question in the front row, Damon Wilson.
Thank you, General Schissler. I just want to pick up on Hans's points, but then ask a different question. I mean, if you think about what we did during the Cold War in Berlin, West Berlin, at the height of that challenge, less than 6,000 troops. If you think about what we do in Korea today, the point is a permanent American commitment that serves as a tripwire that leaves unquestioned America's commitment to the defense of these nations. And so I know the alliance is working through this. I would certainly strongly argue for a permanent American military presence in the Baltic states to serve that type of function, to convey that. That said, I know that's a political decision, but can you talk about what the alliance has done already? Can you sort of itemize for us and help the audience understand a little bit better about how the alliance has moved east, both the United States and other allies in the Baltic states and Poland and Romania, and what the nature of the conversation is about there? I think we've had SHAPE officials refer to these as persistent presence. I would certainly argue strongly that we just not be shy about it and argue for a permanent presence, which would be a change in NATO policy, one that I think is very much called for today. I just welcome your comments a little bit on what the reassurance posture looks like and how planning is going forward for moving the alliance eastward, if you will.
Okay. So reassurance-wise, the alliance secured more airplanes, put them in Poland, as well as in 2 locations, Estonia and Lithuania, for air policing. And last weekend deployed 600 American troops from the 173rd in Vicenza to the Baltic nations in groups of 150 in the 3 Balts and Poland. And then a variety of measures on the Navy side on the Black Sea in Bulgaria and Romania of late, with, I think, more to follow. And some of those are national contributions that appear and are helpful to NATO in the position, but they're not actually tasked or responsive to a NATO request.
Just a quick follow-up. I mean, we have heard various scenarios sort of being played out, including from General Breedlove, who was concerned, I believe, and still may be, of a Russian force advance across the south of Ukraine to Transnistria. And I know the NATO ally Romania is really concerned about this, but tends not to get the headlines and tends not to seem to get the forces, even though there's a U.S. base or the U.S. has access in places like Constanza and in other facilities in Romania. I recall sort of even before this crisis that there was a routine U.S. military presence in Romania, rotational access. Is that still going on? Should that be played more clearly in the communications of the alliance? If it's not going on, is there any thought to sort of strengthening this one ally in particular who seems to be always left off the lists, yet may be the most directly threatened in the near term?
So in Romania, the Black Sea Rotational Force, a Marine unit, has operated there over the last, I think, 3 years, very successfully, training and operating with the Romanians. Additionally, as we redeployed out of Afghanistan, we've used their port facility and airport very effectively to move people through Romania. It's been very helpful. With regard to should we be doing more, I don't know if I can tell you we should or we shouldn't. We have regular conversations with them. I talk to General Danila, their Chad, quite often. They are very concerned. They have a long-standing military that needs new equipment, and they're working on re-equipping. But they do depend on NATO to defend their flanks quite a bit.
Thanks. Question from Ian Brzezinski.
General, welcome to the Atlantic
Hi.
Council. Thank
Thank
you
you.
for your time. 2 questions. What are the West Europeans doing akin to what the United States is doing in terms of putting forces into Central Europe? Are there German or French companies going into the Baltics? Are they carrying their share? And then the second question is, shouldn't NATO be doing things now to reassure Ukraine in the short term? What I hear from you and from other NATO officials is that they're talking on the defense side about long-term defense reform, force modernization, things that will take 3 or 4 or 5 years. The problem is we have Russian forces on Ukraine's border. We have special forces, Russian special forces in Ukraine creating instability. They're in a position to change the day within 12 hours. Yet the alliance doesn't seem to be doing anything to help Ukraine with that situation. Instead, our deployments have created a de facto red line saying, we'll defend NATO proper, but we're not going to do anything in the near term to help Ukraine defend itself.
So let me try and answer your second question, and don't give the mic away because I'm going to need you to remind me about your first question, which was pretty good as well. The second question is, shouldn't we be doing something militarily? As of now, the decision has been in NATO that it should respond politically and not militarily, and that hasn't changed. I appreciate the assertion that we should do more, and many of our member nations are doing things on a bilateral basis. But the alliance has, to date, elected to respond politically and call for a political resolution, not a military confrontation. So I think that sort of clarifies why we're doing what we're doing with regard to the alliance itself. And remind me a couple questions.
The first question was, what's Western European nations
okay,
in
thanks.
NATO doing? The Germans in particular,
Actually,
where are they?
Ian, hopefully the U.S. was able to quickly respond with forces in both air and ground examples. It would be the hope that other member nations will backfill those in coming months, and that would be their ability to contribute over time. I think the chairman and I have talked about this many times. It's way more effective to have 5 flags on the ground than it is to have all of the response come from the United States. And speaking as a NATO official, I would rather see 5 nations contributing in 4 different places than to see the United States contributing all the forces in 5 different places. I think it sends a much stronger signal of the cohesion of the alliance. I happen to know that the ambassadors agree with that. it's up to the capitals then to make decisions to actually deploy forces and spend them that way. So I think there's much agreement around that idea. You make an interesting question about Western European nations because they're actually closer, but our forces that we moved were also in Europe. And so I spent a lot of my career in the last 5 years arguing for why it's important to keep our forces in Europe. I'm glad I did because they served a tremendous service by being in Vicenza, being in Ramstein, able to fly the companies into the nations on our airplanes. They will go back again and airdrop them because those are paratroopers. We think the symbolism of paratroopers dropping out of airplanes is a valuable signal. And so the fact that we have the forces permanently stationed in Europe has been very useful, and I think we need to always be thinking about whether we have them divided around the world in the most effective way. There are many calls to bring them all home, as you know, but I think this proves the value of forward stationing at least a proportion of your forces in a place as important as Europe.
Interesting. I would just follow on by saying, it also sends important but different signals to be deploying forces from the continental United States. That sends a powerful signal. And then someone mentioned at our conference last week that even though there were 600 U.S. service people deployed or something, that it's noteworthy that their other 1.3 plus million friends are also somewhat related to that deployment. Yes, in the back middle right over there.
Thank you very much, General, for the presentation. I'm Gabriel Balayan, Fulbright visiting scholar at the Library of Congress. Actually, I would like to know your views about Georgia prospective membership to NATO. Yesterday at Brookings, Georgian defense minister said that they have all boxes checked and they now seek full membership instead of any kind of cooperation. What is your views, the time frame? Thanks.
Thanks. Expanding NATO has been a topic of great interest, and Georgia's membership, particularly in light of their contribution in Afghanistan, significant numbers of troops and taken casualties and served without any caveats, is greatly appreciated by NATO. The decision for them to become a member, or any other nation to become a member of NATO, is one that's held by the North Atlantic Council. Each of the aspirant nations comes to the Council and reports on their progress at least once a year, and I have been in several of those from the Republic of Georgia. Appreciate them. The decision still has to be made by the Council. There is much discussion about whether the next summit will be an occasion upon which nations will be admitted to NATO, and that's something that there are no decisions made now. Much conversation will go on between now and then about whether to admit nations at that time. With regard to whether they've met the standard or not, clearly not a military issue. It's one that the Council has to make that decision on. I just watch them have that conversation. And I have no personal opinion on that. I know as a military person, I greatly appreciate the contribution and the kinds of soldiers that Georgia has made available to NATO, particularly in Afghanistan.
Thank you. Right in the middle on the aisle here, Mr. Masatik.
Mike Masetic, PBS Online NewsHour. There's a very interesting story in Sunday's New York Times indicating that a number of these fighters in Ukraine were previously Soviet fighters in Afghanistan. And so on the company level, they're pretty experienced and know how to fight a kind of a local war. And it also indicated that they all had totally different objectives about what they wanted and what their ultimate ambitions were. Does this jibe with your intelligence on what's going on there? And then in the larger sense, I guess it's hard to make a contingency for a civil war, but what are the contingencies if this thing just spills into a civil war, but short of overt Russian intervention?
I'll make the standard disclaimer because you suggested what was my intelligence information tell you. I can't tell any of that. And I read the same newspaper as you do. Thanks for all the information you provide because, in fact, most of the open source information right now is some of the best information we get. And so I don't have any particular knowledge about who trained where, what experiences they brought, anything beyond what you read. I don't have any other knowledge about that. What are the plans if it spills into a full-out civil war? Actually, not a NATO question, and I don't think I'm current on any thinking at NATO about a civil war and how we would respond to that as a civil war is internal to a country. As much as we care how this turns out, I have not heard that conversation in Brussels at all. Again, this is a fast developing event. I've only been gone for like 4 days, but I haven't heard that line of conversation at all in Brussels of yet.
I think it does relate, though, to one of the themes in your presentation, which is the power of people, and certainly over the last 20 or 25 years, the threats emanating from within states are in many ways can be as great as the threats from state-sponsored challenges. And I would think in light of those trends, we're going to see more sort of internal spillover, potentially abetted by state sponsorship. We have a NATO member right now, Turkey, who is threatened by a civil war in neighboring Syria. And I would think that the question is a good one for NATO planners to consider, which is, even if you're not as concerned about Ukraine's security directly, the potential threats from a spillover of a large-scale civil war right on NATO's borders, refugees, other types of threats, is very potentially significant. And I think the alliance has to, as they say, walk and chew gum at the same time. Agreed. Regarding these different types of security challenges to members' defenses.
Agree.
Next question. How about Michael Gordon in the front here?
Yeah, Michael Gordon, New York Times. Sir, when I was at the NATO foreign ministers meeting the other month, the Ukrainian foreign minister said that a NATO team was going to go to Kiev to assess Ukrainian military needs at this point in time. They might not be met by the alliance per se. They might be met bilaterally, but the NATO was to assess this. Did this team ever complete this work? What are Ukraine's military needs, regardless of who might fill them? And lastly, the 600-odd personnel who are in the 4 companies, what is, beyond the symbolism of it, what is the military utility of this exercise? What's the actual point? What are you trying to accomplish with it? How long is it going to last? A couple of weeks? And what happens next? Thank you.
Okay. So the second question, the expected duration of this deployment is about 2 months. The purpose is to exercise and train with the local forces and to reassure the people. And that's exactly what we were asked to do. And I actually think, as small as it sounds when you talk about 150 people, it sends a tremendous signal to the nation and to the people. And I actually witnessed that in Latvia. It made a profound difference to the way they saw the world, knowing that the United States had deployed those soldiers and were training there. And I went and saw both our soldiers and their army, and they were just beginning to do the planning, as you might guess, because it was a relatively unplanned deployment. What they would train and what kinds of things they will do is being determined real time. And they're doing, that's something that's normally planned 2 or 3 months in advance. So what they'll actually do is yet to be planned together, because it has to be useful for both our forces and their forces.
And is that a NATO exercise, a U.S. multilateral exercise?
So it's currently a bilateral event that the United States deployed the forces at the request of each of those nations. And it may turn into an arrangement where those forces come under NATO command and control if that's approved. That's currently being staffed and the decision hasn't been made yet. So they're currently under U.S. command and control.
And the first question was the team that went into Ukraine, the NATO assessment team.
So how do you remember all this, Barry? So the answer to that question, to my knowledge, and I could be wrong, but to my knowledge, I don't think that team has gone. Immediately after that, the situation in Kiev was so unstable that almost no one went there. It was unsafe to be in Kiev at that particular moment. The Director General of the IMS, Sir Chris Harper, was there for a different reason and met with their leadership, their military leadership, but I don't believe the assessment you asked about has happened yet.
Next question, this gentleman in the second row here. If you could pass the mic, that'd be great. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Come back to the Baltics for a moment. If I understood you correctly, you said that if the Russians opened a front in the Baltics, a military front, that the NATO reaction would be land, sea, and air. In the military committees and shapes deliberations on that, how long do you think it will last? A conventional local conflict in the Baltics would last, and would it remain local and conventional?
That's actually a great question that I'm not going to even go close to answering. I have no idea how long it could last. I hope it doesn't ever happen, and that's our main intention, is to deter that from happening, not to be, I just don't even want to think about that becoming our main piece of work. So our main interest is to resolve it, not to get to that. I shudder to think how long that could last, so I don't even want to go there, actually. I have no answer. I've never been prepped on anything close to that question. I have no idea how to answer it in a meaningful way without really saying something that sounds outlandish. So it's a really dangerous proposition in the sense that we want to deter that, not see it happen.
Yes, this gentleman in the back.
Ken Meyergard, World Docs. Is NATO proud of the results of its aggression against Libya?
What are NATO's feelings about the Libya operation?
We actually saw a lot of positive things happen in Libya, and it's still been very difficult, and that's a nation that's still developing. The difficulties that they have today are not directly attributed to what NATO did there. And so it was militarily an effective operation.
The Atlantic Council is releasing a report this week on Libya. It's the most comprehensive such report, I think, released in quite a long time. But I do think, the question raises the issue of follow-through. So the combat phase was over, and then there wasn't, as we all know, I think the military calls it phase 4. What was the sense in NATO? And the reason I raise this is because it is relevant for any future operations. There was a NATO effort to do the first part, but there didn't seem to be as much of a formal institutional NATO effort to follow through after the intensive phase was completed.
I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Yes, over here.
Thank you, General. My name is Igor Dunaevsky I'm a reporter for a Russian newspaper. My question is, you are saying that in a scenario of civil war or something is, internal Ukraine issue. But do you think this destabilized situation or any civil war can pose a threat to energy infrastructure in Ukraine, and especially pipelines that deliver gas from Russia to Ukraine? And can that be consequently a threat to European and NATO members who depend highly on Russian gas? So does not NATO has any plans to help Ukrainians probably how to defend this infrastructure? And secondly, United States is sending some non-lethal military aid to Ukraine these days. Do NATO has any plans to help Ukraine with something like some non-lethal military aid? Thank you.
Okay. Let me take your last one first. I'm not aware of NATO plans, and I may be just uninformed regarding non-lethal aid. I think our member nations, many of them are doing that. I'm not aware of NATO as the alliance planning to do that, but I could be completely wrong on that. So I wouldn't put a lot of stock in that answer. I've never seen data on that. Your first question is superb. Energy matters a lot, and in a lot of briefs I will include a slide that talks about energy, because energy matters in Ukraine, it matters in Estonia. The distribution of energy products is defining in a lot of ways and is going to be causal in a lot of conflicts, not just this one. So you're wise to bring that into the conversation. We haven't addressed it. It will play. If this started in the middle of the winter, I think it would already be playing. The fact that the demand for gas is a little bit lessened by the temperate weather right now, it won't become a factor until harsh winter hits again. If Russia was to use gas supply as a tool against Ukraine, prices already rose, as you're well aware, and that puts a burden already. While I was in Latvia, they also have energy concerns because they also store and get gas a variety of ways, but they're dependent on the distribution of that, and it's different for almost every country. So while a pipeline may pass through your country, you may not get any service from it. It may just be transiting your country. And so I think energy is something that every one of us ought to keep in the front of our mind all the time, as it's going to be defining in why people get into conflicts in some cases, and certainly in Europe, the distribution of gas. And then I also would bring into that just the comment about shale. As shale is explored and drawn out, it's going to redefine who's powerful and who's got money. And that's all going to change in the next 10 or 15 years. Some countries that have no money are going to have money, and they're going to have shale production, and they're going to get paid for it, and their status is going to change in the world. So that's worth all of our attention.
Mm-hmm. One of the many trends we're tracking. I think we have time for one or two last questions. The two in the back there, why don't we, in the back row, why don't we take both of those at the same time, and then we'll wrap up.
Thank you. Ivan Lebedev with Russian news agency TASS. General, you said about various NATO missions all over the world during your presentation. And if I'm not mistaken, there are at least a couple of them that Russia takes part in. In particular, I mean the so-called Northern Route for deliveries to international forces in Afghanistan and anti-pirate maritime patrolling operation at the east coast of Africa. So my question is, have the contradictions over Ukraine between NATO and Russia affected in any way the cooperation between Russia and NATO in these endeavors? And my second question is, if I may, Alexander Verzbow said recently that if Russia won't change its behavior, NATO will have to consider it not as a partner, but rather than adversary. So the question is, does it make any sense from the practical point of view for NATO to make such assessment and to consider this or that country as an adversary or as a foe or as a partner, and to put some kind of labels on that? Or are these relations more complex and cannot be identified or evaluated in just in one word? Thank you.
Great. And the next question?
Thank you. Stephen Cross from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. General, you mentioned strategic outlook from a slightly more longer-term perspective. The security guarantee is the foundation of NATO, and the nurture child of that really has been the EU. But these organizations now seem to be at a different point in time in terms of their enlargement, ambitions, and progress. And the current crisis seems to antagonize this kind of misoverlay of framework, since the EU has no credible collective defense guarantee. Do you think there has to be a strategic rethink between the EU and NATO about how they're going to coordinate enlargement in the periphery in the future?
So 3 questions. First one, Russia's involved in some alliance operations, counter-piracy, and helping with the Northern Distribution Network. Has that been affected at all?
Yeah, let me take both your questions at the same time. Actually, everything about NATO's relationship with Russia has been affected by their actions in Ukraine. And NATO has made a difficult decision that the partnership that existed with Russia has been temporarily put on hold or suspended. It's available to reignite if the circumstances change. Both the Secretary General and Ambassador Vershbow talked about Russia acting like an adversary. They're not acting like a partner right now, and so we can't pursue partnership activities. One you didn't mention was we were in the midst of negotiating how to do the Syrian chemical weapons move using Russian escort at exactly the time this happened. We were in intensive negotiations with Russian military so that they could participate as part of that escort mission. And that is also suspended. It's unfortunate because that was a great opportunity, a great military opportunity for NATO to operate with Russia, also suspended. So.
And the last question was NATO and EU enlargement. The map for both organizations covers different countries. Is there any sense in the issues or that creates or the prospects for future enlargement?
I'm not going to comment on enlargement because I'm not sure how to go there between 2 organizations that have different memberships. What is currently in play and the opportunity that is before us is the opportunity for NATO and the European Union to work together more frequently and more transparently. It's one of the ironies of Brussels. We live in the same city, and yet we don't have time to get together very often because we both have full calendars of meetings that keep all of our people at the right levels busy, but not busy together. And so the leadership on the military side and the political side seeks the opportunity, and we're in conversation with the EU from NATO and them with us to say we need to get together more often. On the military side, let me give you an example of why it's an interesting conversation to have. There aren't 2 sets of forces. There's only the forces. There's only what the nations have in whichever group you're talking about. And if NATO has got them fully employed, then there's no other forces to talk about, even if the EU wanted to do something. In the case of EU operations, they've done a variety of military things of late, and they're very helpful in a variety of things, particularly right now in Africa. But they have to draw on the same set of forces that NATO draws on from its membership, except they have some different members than we do. But you can see my point. It's not as if there's a set of forces for EU and a set of forces for NATO. We just decide how we're going to use them, and it really doesn't matter. We're all drawn on the same political will and the same set of military forces from our member nations. But we have the opportunity to collaborate a lot more, and we recognize that as an opportunity.
Well, General, thank you so much for your time, for giving us the benefit of your insights and your thoughts on not just NATO planning, but sort of key challenges worldwide. And we would welcome you back at any point in the future. But thanks very much for.
Thanks, Greg.